Okay, this is our first classification problem. The data set is a data set from a bank, Pilgrim Bank. It's got data on 31,000 plus customers. Each customer, it tells you how many dollars of profit were made in 1999. That's what the nines indicate. It's all 1999 data. The zeros indicate year 2000 data. So profits for each customer, whether or not they were an online customer, using online banking, what their age was in 1999, and you will notice there's a lot of missing data there, and it turns out it's really important to account for the missing data because it is probably the single most important variable in this data set. So anyway, we're missing some other variables. We're missing income, 1999. Income is actually, if you look at the column information, it's in categories. It's listed as a continuous variable showing income. First category is less than 15,000, 15 to 20, and so on. Ninth category, 125,000 plus. There is a choice here whether to put it in as a nominal or a continuous variable. And if you're building a regression model, you probably should explore that. In a decision tree, it doesn't matter a whole lot because the decision tree is just looking for breakpoints. And it doesn't matter if you make it think it's continuous or nominal, it's going to look at the values in this column, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 9, and look at splitting it in various places. So it really doesn't matter whether it's continuous or nominal. Tenure is the length of years that this, I believe, years as a customer of the bank. District is a nominal variable. It's coded as continuous here. I'll change it just so we don't get confused about it. But it's again, it doesn't matter for a decision tree. It doesn't really care which type of variable it is. It has 3 values. There are some coding of what district the customers are in. There are 3 different districts, and by far 1,200 is the district with the most customers in this data set. We have one more 1999 variable, and that's whether or not this customer used electronic bill pay, which in 1999 was a pretty new service. So you won't find there are too many customers with electronic bill pay. I'll make it nominal, even though it doesn't matter for the decision tree, just as a reminder. Online banking was used a lot more commonly. In fact, if we look at online and bill pay, 1999, 12% of the customers used online banking, but only 1.6% used electronic bill pay. I'm sure both of those numbers are higher today than they were 17 years ago. Then we have some data for year 2000, profits each customer, whether or not they were online banking, whether or not they used electronic bill pay. You'll notice, though, if you look at the profit in year 2000, there's a lot of missing data, and the reason is that these customers were not retained. So I built a formula here for retained. If the profit is missing in the year 2000, that customer was not retained, otherwise they were retained. And in a classification problem, what you want to explain is a nominal variable. It can have more than 2 categories, and most of these techniques sort of work exactly the same way. It's easiest to think about just 2 categories, and that's the most common use here. Do we retain the customer or not? That's a basic question. Will this person that visits our website buy our product or not? Will the student that applied to a particular college enroll or not? Will the student be retained to the 2nd year or not? Will they graduate or not? There's lots of binary variables that we might want to explain. So retention is a classic case. And we'd want to explain retention using whatever information we have available. We can't use the year 2000 variables, though. It'll be obvious because if we use online to predict retained, we'll get a really good model because we don't have any online customers and we haven't retained them. But that's not information you have in 1999. So the model we'd want to build is to try to explain retained using the 1999 data. Now I'm going to set this up for validation because with a data set this large, we really should be doing validation, although I'll show you that in fact JMP is not require you to do validation as much as other software programs actually would. But to set it up for validation, you can go into column to new column. And let's make it character nominal. Hold on a second here. I forgot for a moment where they put it. The validation column, you go ahead to analyze to predictive modeling, and it says make validation column. And we'll accept the defaults here. Usually 25 or 30% is usually set as the validation set. It is increasingly common to make 3 sets: a training data, which is the data used in building the model where you know the value of the Y variable, a validation set that you're then really using to steer the model creation, because it's ultimately, if you don't want to overfit the training data, what you want to do is have it predict as well as possible for data that wasn't used in building the model. But because overfitting is so easy to do with powerful computer techniques, many people, an increasing number now, also set some portion as a test data set. So they might use 30% validation, 10% test set. The test set is held aside completely, so that, because these techniques will look at the validation set to try to get the best model, which is still a form of kind of overfitting. You're using the training data, but then you're evaluating the model on the validation set. You can get a better model because if it predicts better on the validation set, but then you may be overfitting for the validation set. So the test set is held completely aside to ultimately, after you built the model, then see how it will perform. I won't worry about that level of it here. So we'll just split it into training and validation. 25% of the data is going to be held out as a validation set, not used in building the model, but used to evaluate it, because the 25% that we're holding out, we do know whether that customer is retained or not. And so we can see whether the model did a good prediction or not, even though it didn't use those rows in building the model. You'll see that in all the predictive models, there is an option that allows you to create a validation set as you go along. So it's not necessary to make a validation column. The advantage, though, is that as long as we make a validation column, then we can continue to use the same validation column when we want to compare one technique to another, and we'll have 5 or 6 different ways of modeling classification problems. So in order to not have randomness enter the comparison of one technique with another, because the validation set keeps changing, we use the same validation set for either. So let's go, let's see, we don't need a formula, we'll do a fixed random set. So it has now used a random number to create this set, but the validation set is now 25% of the data and 75% is training. So let's see what a decision tree looks like. Go to predictive modeling, go to partition. We want to explain whether or not the customer's been retained. We want to use their profits, whether or not they were online, what age category they're in, what income category, how long they've been with the bank, what district they live in, and whether or not they use bill pay. Validation, you put in the validation box. Notice down here, validation portion. If we didn't create a validation column, we could have put 0.25 in here, and it would automatically randomly pick 25% of rows and hold them out for validation. The difference, though, then is when we use another technique and you use the validation portion again, they'll get a different validation portion. By creating this column, we're keeping it the same column of data, same validation set for each of the methods that we run the model on. Informative missing is checked. You could take it off, but you really want to leave that on. And we'll run a decision tree. So initially, it starts with all of the data basically kept together. There's no branches to a tree yet. It's actually showing this line across is showing the fraction of the data set that is not retained. And it looks like it's on the order of about 20%. So it's about 80, it's actually a little over 80% that are retained, and a little under 20% that are not retained. In fact, it's right here. You can see the rate, 17% not retained and 83% retained. Let's go ahead and split. Don't worry about those graphs that are down there. We'll get to them in a minute. So the first split it did is actually, is the age greater than 1, remember these are categories for age, so I forget, 1 is up to, it's child. I don't remember if it's up to 10 years old, something like that, but these are basically children. So are they not children and not missing, or children or missing? That's the single biggest, the biggest differentiator between being retained and not being retained. And if you click on this red arrow, I think the details, let me see what it do, show details. Oh, yeah, you can get additional details. I wasn't sure if it was a default that it shows retained and not retained. Let me just make sure here. Yeah, if it's not showing up, this is where you want to go. Show split probability, and split count probably is good, or all of these is fine. But the split probabilities are the most important, I think, because if you look down here, it's saying that if the age is not missing and it's not a child, only 7%, 8% are not retained. Whereas 42% are not retained if it's a child or if age was missing. That's actually quite a large difference. If you do split again, the next best split is looking at those where the age was not missing. Have they been with the bank more than 7.8 years or less? If they've been more than 7.8 years, the retention, the customer churn reduces to 5.4%, whereas it's 10% if they've been with the customer less than 7.8 years. That's the next best place to split. So just like we did with the houses, I'm not going to focus on each particular split. You can look at them in detail. Let's just do split. I would recommend doing it, something like 15 times. And maybe actually, so that I don't have to keep scrolling as much, let's not show the tree. That's a lot better. I can just keep getting split. All right, there's a bunch, and there's about 30, 40 splits. Notice what it's showing for column contributions. Age was the most important variable. It appeared in only 5 splits, but it was extremely powerful, and that's because it was missing. When age is missing, that is a very big variable. Tenure is used, the length of time they were with the bank, 10 times in splits. And it was the second most important variable. Close behind it was the income, and that was used in 11. You can see that whether or not they were a bill pay customer it appeared in 5 splits, but it has very little contribution to explaining retained customers versus not retained customers. We don't usually use R squared as meaning anything here. It's not, the R squared will never be high in these kind of variables because the variable we're trying to explain is been turned into a 0-1 variable, retained or not retained. And customers are either going to be retained or not retained, and you can't interpret how close the points are to a line like with R squared in a linear regression. The accuracy of the model is better determined by other methods, which I'll go into here in a second. Let's just see what the small tree looks like. It's actually not so small when you do that many splits, so even though it's an abbreviated tree, you can see it's quite difficult to actually view. But it has built out this tree. We could set a minimum split size to prevent overfitting, but since we have the validation, we probably will have a better idea about whether we overfit the model. I think what I would look at next is, and if it's not, well, let's see if I have the confusion matrix. You want to have ROC curve checked. I've set that as a platform option so that it's there. And maybe the confusion matrix is also not shown. Just make sure it's not an option here. Oh, we can do show fit details. We'll use that for now. Yeah, that gives us confusion matrix. So these are various measures. There's some numerical measures about how well it fits the data. This R squared is actually not measured the same way. It's not the best measure to look at, so I don't usually look at that anyway. Often people look at the misclassification rate. And notice there's two columns here. It shows you this data for the training data and for the validation data. Usually you will find, not always, but most of the time, you'll find that the measures of fit are better in the training data than the validation data. Because the training data was used to build a model, the validation data is only being used to say, well, how does it do on data that was not used in building the model? Misclassification is how many wrong classifications there are. It was 15.8% for the training data. It's a little bit higher, 16.1% for the validation data. When overfitting occurs, what you'll find is that this number starts to become much lower than this number. And if we kept building the tree down so the branches, the leaf get smaller and smaller, we will end up with much lower errors, misclassifications for the training data, but the misclassifications of the validation data will start going up and become quite large. Here are what's called confusion matrices, and here's what you can actually see about where correct and incorrect predictions are done. And I will caution you, the confusion matrix is a really nice thing to look at, but it's built on an assumption, and it's one that we're going to want to change. The assumption is that when it makes a prediction, it's actually calculating the probability of each person in the data set being retained or not retained. And it uses a 50% cutoff for making its predictions in the confusion matrix. In other words, if the probability is predicted to be greater than 50%, it'll say retained. If its probability of retention is less than 50%, it'll predict not retained. And especially in models where you have a rare occurrence, when the event retention is very low, you would find that the model will often not predict anybody will be retained. It may predict nobody has a probability as high as 50% of being retained. That is not unusual. In these classification models, it's very common to get one of the categories, nobody being predicted to be in there. It doesn't mean the model isn't doing a good job of predicting it. It just may be that nobody rises to this 50% level of probability, but some people may have higher probabilities than others, and that's what you are really interested in is if the highest probability is 40%, but if that's a good predictor of somebody being retained, the model is very useful because it says this person has a 40% chance of being retained, whereas this other person has a 10% chance. And if the 40% is predictive, it's a good model, even though it wasn't as high as 50%. You would just want to change the cutoff. Maybe you should drop it to 30%, and we'll look at ways to do that. So what you can see in the training matrix is if you look at the diagonal elements, the top left and the bottom right, these are correct predictions. The top left one is model is predicting they will be not retained, and they actually were not retained. Here the model is predicting they will be retained, and the model they actually were retained. So these are both correct predictions. Same thing in the validation set. These diagonal elements are correct. The misclassifications are the two off-diagonal ones, and that's what's going into this misclassification rate. If you add up 974 and 300, those 1,274 people out of this total is what the 16% misclassification is. Now, it's also important to realize that in most problems, especially in most business problems, you're going to find that these two erroneous predictions are not equally serious. Usually one of them will be much more serious than the other. In this context, let's say we're trying to predict who's going to be retained as a customer of the bank. And the action that we're likely to take because of this is if we think the customer is not going to be retained, we're going to make them some kind of valuable offer in order to try to keep them as a customer. If we wrongly predict that people will not be retained when they actually are retained, then we're wasting our money. We're throwing free offers at people that it's just costing us money. On the other hand, if we predict that somebody will be retained and they're actually not, model says they're going to be retained, we decide, oh, don't send them a free offer. We lose the customer. That's a lot more serious for most businesses. Customer acquisition is a lot more expensive than customer retention. So having to go out and then replace that customer by getting a new one is going to cost us a lot more than whatever we would have sent them to keep them as a customer. So you usually have an asymmetry of the costs of making these errors, and that's going to be an important feature of trying to use this model and fine-tune it. So we're not just, and that's why I look at the misclassification rate, but I don't put a lot of emphasis on it because it's basically equating errors. It's just saying how many are errors, not which type. It's not putting any more emphasis on one type of error than another. So it's just an overall misclassification. I prefer to look at the confusion matrix in detail because it can look at these two different kinds of errors. Here we've got almost 1,000 people in the validation set that we predicted would be retained and they weren't. And we've got 300 people that we predicted would not be retained and we actually retained them. So these 300 we sent free offers to, or free goodies, and wasted our money. But there are 1,000 people here that we did not send anything to and we actually lost them as customers. I'd rather reverse those two. And how would I reverse these two? Well, instead of using a 50% cutoff for predicting retention, my problem here is I predicted too many people to be retained that actually were not retained. I'd actually like to predict fewer people to be retained. So rather than have a 50% cutoff, I actually might want to raise that. I might want to say, I don't feel good unless it's at least a 70% probability of retention to predict this person will be retained, because I'd like to lower these kind of errors. And in doing that, I will, of course, increase these type of errors, because I can't reduce both those type of errors except to build a better model to begin with. We will see that there are some tools available, a couple in JMP, that allow us to do this sort of automatically. Let me get to this other display. This is actually what I use the most to try to evaluate models. It's called the receiver operating characteristic. It's that nice intuitive name, which is odd. The ROC curve is showing two things. It's showing on the x-axis 1 minus the specificity. What is the specificity? The specificity is the true negatives divided by, so let's stick on the left-hand side here, the training data. True negatives. What are true negatives? These are the true negatives. So it's actually looking at the true negatives divided by true negatives plus false positives. False positives mean we predict they would be retained, so, but they're not. So it's looking at 1038 divided by the sum of these two. And this is 1 minus the specificity. The sensitivity is what's on the vertical axis, and the sensitivity is known as the true positives, which is this, divided by the true positives plus the false negatives. False negatives would be these. So we're taking this cell divided by the sum of these two. It's hard to keep this all in your head, so let's just talk about what the shape of this looks like. This 45-degree line, this represents a random allocation of customers into retained and not retained. At the very bottom here, 0, 0, suppose we predict nobody will be retained. Okay, nobody will be retained. What is going to be our, what's the specificity? How many true negatives out of the true negatives and the false positives? If we predict nobody's going to be retained, in other words, we are predicting we'll lose all our customers. We're going to get all of the true negatives, right? Because we predicted nobody would be retained. Customers aren't retained, we got them all. So 1 minus the specificity is going to be at 0. Sensitivity. How many true positives will we get? We're not predicting anybody will be retained. We're not getting any true positives. That's why we're getting 0, 0. On the other hand, up here, we're predicting that everybody will be retained. If you predict everybody will be retained, you'll get all the true positives, and you will get none of the true negatives, because we're not predicting any negatives. So 1 minus 0 is 1, so we're getting the 1, 1 point. Suppose it's in the middle. Suppose we did 50% randomly selected customers will predict they'll be retained, and 50% will predict they'll not be retained. Then we're going to get 50% of the true positives, and we're going to get 50% of the true negatives. And so all of the points in this line you could interpret as a random allocation of X% of the people. This point would be 20% of the people randomly selected to be positives. No model, just random selection. So this 45-degree line represents a random model. Just randomly pick some percent and predict that they'll be retained or not retained, either way. A perfect model would actually be up in this corner up here. Oops. Can't move that back. Yeah. Right up here. This point represents a perfect model because what does it do? It gets 100% of the true positives, that's sensitivity, and it gets 100% of the true negatives, which is specificity, so 1 minus 100% is 0. So a perfect model would actually start at this point, would go straight up to here, and then straight across to there. And this is where this measure comes, that's called area here. It's known as the area under the curve, the AUC. And in a perfect model, if your curve actually started at 0, went straight up and across, what is the area under that? Well, the area under that curve is, it's a rectangle. You've got horizontal distance times the vertical distance, 1 times 1, the area under that curve is 1. The random model, this 45-degree line, is a triangle under that curve, 1/2 the base, which is 1, times the height, which is 1, you get 1/2. What is the area under the curve here? 0.7927. These are just sort of mirror images of each other because it's either retained or not retained. Whichever you focus on, the area under the curve is almost 0.8. This is your single best measure of how good this model is. So it could be as high as 1 if it was a perfect model. If the model was just as good as random, it would be 0.5. This is better closer to a perfect model than to a random model. So it's actually not, not too bad at doing its prediction. But the most important thing about this curve is it doesn't rely on a 50% cutoff like the confusion matrix does. It's basically when you move along one of these curves, so let's look at the retained curve, the blue. As you move along that blue curve, what's happening is you're altering the threshold for probability of retention, making a prediction of retention. And you're alternating from 0% to 100%. And as you raise that threshold, you trace along this blue curve. And so it's actually giving you a representation of all the possible cutoff values. So it's not unusual, especially with a rare event, when you look at the confusion matrix, with a rare event, you may find almost no predictions, maybe even 0 predictions of that rare event. But if you come up here to the area under the curve and it's like 0.8, it's basically saying if you just pick a different cutoff, you actually will get a pretty good model. We'll be able to differentiate between who's retained and who's not retained. As to what that cutoff value is, there is a way graphically to find it, I think, by looking at lines tangent to these curves, but with a slope of 1. So I think you can actually get it that way, but I think far better is to actually use some other tools to actually explore how the cutoff value affects the predictions of retention. So to look at those tools, let me first show you. If you go to Save Columns here, if you save the prediction formula, what you get in the data set now are 3 new columns. It shows the probability of each person not being retained, the probability they will be retained. And this most likely column is by a formula that automatically is using a 50% cutoff because it basically says which of these is greater. Whichever probability is greater, that's the prediction it's going to make. You could alter the cutoff value here by weighting these differently, not equally, but that's a little messy to do by formulas, so we look at a different tool for doing it. So just remember this most likely column is just predicted using a 50% cutoff. What I find more interesting than that is actually look at two distributions here. Look at the probability of retention and retained. Here's the customers we're predicting we will lose. Notice where their probabilities, all of the very low probabilities, were actually not retained. So when the model, it looks like everybody below 50%, actually below about 55%, so somewhere around here. All of these people, model gave us a low probability of retention and we didn't retain any of them. Unfortunately, we've got a few people up here, you can see the darker shading, that model predicted pretty high probability they would be retained, but they were not retained. That's unfortunate, so we missed those people. Don't be fooled by the fact that it's only a small portion of the bar. What we really care about is how many people are in there, and they're big enough for your eye to see, although not as large as the ones in this range. From this, I'd say a better model already would be to use a cutoff probability of something like 0.65. Anything above 0.65, let's predict retained. Then the only errors we're going to have are these people up here. And all of these, of course, we're going to make errors with the people that were retained, but are on these low probabilities below 0.65 of being retained. But the errors are not symmetric, so I'd be willing to make a few more errors and believe that we're going to retain customers that we don't retain because I'm just wasting a little money sending them a free offer. What I really don't want to do is I don't want the model to basically have all of these people that, or the ones above 50%, I'm predicting they will be retained and they're not retained because then I have to acquire a new customer to replace them. So looking at these probabilities and comparing them to what actually happens is another suggestive way of giving you a feel for the fact that we can do better here by not sticking to the 50% cutoff. We should probably alter the cutoff some. So I'm going to look at two automated tools for doing that. Okay, the first of these tools you need to download from JMP Community. It's an add-in, and the add-in is what's called the ROC and PAUC analysis. Computes ROC curves and the area under the curve for one or more tests or predictors. So I believe that's the one. No, it's not. Okay, for this particular add-in, you have to go to JMP Community Forum and download, it's called the Alternate Cutoff Confusion Matrix. I've already downloaded it here. And then if you open that, you actually get an install message. When you install it, it should appear under the add-ins here. So that's very handy to have this on the menu bar. So now when you launch that, it says, what is the target variable? Well, the target variable is retention. The predicted value has to be a probability, so this is the probability of retention. And we do have validation set. And we can specify a range here. Let's say we want to look at all the values from 0.05 to 0.95 in increments of 0.05. And so notice at a cutoff right up here, 0.05, we're saying anything that the model predicts at least a 5% probability of retention will predict retained. And notice the training and validation confusion matrix here only have one column each. Everybody's predicted to be retained. because everybody had a probability of at least 5% of retention from this model. When the probability goes to 1%, now we predict almost everybody will be retained. Look how small the numbers are, both for validation and for training in terms of not retained. We're predicting almost everybody will be retained. That's clearly not what we want. We already know from sort of investigating the probabilities, we want to be above 50%. 50% will put too many errors of people that we lost as customers, but we thought we were going to retain. So let's go to the 0.5. This is already the same numbers that we have seen from our basic model, but oh, and you can do the confusion rates. It's probably easier to think about percents. So here are the errors at 50%. We've got 4% of the customers that we actually retained, but we didn't think we would retain. But 74%, these are row percents. So of the customers actually retained, we predicted 95% would be retained. Of the customers actually not retained, 3/4 of them we thought we would retain. And it's similar numbers here on the validation set. We're making the wrong kind of error here. We would rather shift most of those people down to the bottom left corner from the top right. So let's go down. Let's suppose we did something like 80%. Using an 80% cutoff, of those that we actually retained, we would wrongly predict that 17% would not be retained. But of those that were not retained, we're still predicting 34% of them would be retained, and then we don't do any free offer. We lose that customer. That means that I think we probably don't want to be making that many mistakes. The numbers are actually shown up here, so we do want to not just know percents, we want to know how many people we're talking about. In the validation set, the numbers are not that different. So it's 36% over here and 17% over here and here. So you can see all of these cutoffs. I mean, if we want to go to 90%, now 27% of the lost customers we predicted we would have retained. So 73% we're accurately predicting wouldn't be retained. And we're actually predicting about 70% of the people who are retained. So I might be willing to actually raise my cutoff to 90% and say, as long as the model predicts 90% or above probability of retention, I'm willing to predict them as retained. Otherwise, I'm going to predict that they won't be retained, and I'm probably going to send them some kind of free offer and waste money on a bunch of them, but I'm going to manage to keep a larger number of the people that I would have lost. So I kind of like this because you can actually explore concretely how the model predictions change as you change the cutoff value. So that's an add-in worth using. Another way to look at this, and this is the way marketers commonly do, is to look at lift curves. The lift curve, so let's look at the red for the not retained customers. The way to interpret this is that if you look at, let's say, the 10% line here, right there, that says if you target the 10% of the people with the highest probability, according to the model, of not being retained, you will get about looks like almost 3.2 times as many, which means about 32% of the not retained customers. So focusing on the 10% of the people with the highest probability of not being retained gives us almost a third of the not retained customers. That's what's known as lift, is that you're getting a more than proportionate response. A model that gives you lift of about 1 is basically like a random model. It's saying, if you look at 10% of the people with the highest probability of losing the customer, you're going to get about 10% of the customers that you lose. which is like a random model. The higher this lift is, the more useful it is. You can target customers that the model is giving a high probability of something to, and get a proportionally larger portion of the customer base that you're interested in focusing on. So the higher the lift is, the steeper this curve is, the more it is saying you can use the model to focus your attention on those people with more extreme probabilities. So whether you use that add-in or the lift curve or the ROC curve, it's giving you some indication about whether the model is capable of differentiating between the customers with the probabilities that it's giving. The discrete predictions of what happens if you use a 50% cutoff is not particularly useful because there's nothing magic about the 50% cutoff. Like I said, if you look at variables or events that rarely occur, it's quite common for the model to have very low probabilities for everybody of this happening because it's a rare occurrence. If you're trying to predict fraud, chances are there's nobody in your customer base where there's even a 10% chance of fraud. It's going to be very low percents. If it was really that high, you probably wouldn't have that customer to begin with. So they're going to be low probabilities. The real question, though, is that as long as the model gives different probabilities to different people, is it targeting the right people? The ones that have a higher probability of fraud, are they in fact more likely to engage in fraud? If that's the case, I don't really care whether that probability is 8% or 80%. It's higher than the other people and it's predictive of fraud. It's a useful model. So rather than look at the misclassification rate, look at the ROC curve, look at the lift curve, use the add-in to actually explore different cutoff values. And the final one that I'll point out to you, but it's actually a mess. I will put up a document trying to guide you through this, but the help file actually in JMP works pretty well. And that's to go to specify a profit matrix. What the profit matrix allows you to do is you can, in fact, change the probability threshold here, but what you actually want to do, I think that this might save you having to use the add-in. I'm not sure. I thought they made this part of JMP 13, that add-in. You might, if you ignore the matrix part and use the bottom part, you might be able to, no, it doesn't look like you can put in a whole range of values here. You can just explore a different probability threshold. But the matrix actually allows you to assign benefits and costs or profits for each set of decisions: correct decisions, not retained and retained, not retained and not retained, retained and retained. And the off diagonals, these are where you would put your costs in here. And here, usually you've got negatives on the off diagonal and positives on the diagonal. So if your model makes good predictions, right predictions, you probably, there's something good that happens. And when it makes errors, something bad happens. But this allows you to override these numbers. You can change them. You can say, oh, maybe this way, when we predict that somebody will be retained, but they're actually not retained, we end up losing the customer, and it costs us $1,000 to acquire a new customer. But when prediction is that they won't be retained, and we actually do retain them, the only problem is we sent them a $100 special offer that we wasted money on. But this allows you to put an asymmetry to the cost of making errors. The profit matrix is rather subtle, though, if you actually use it, and it's often very difficult to figure out exactly what numbers go in there. The JMP help file, and it'll be in the document where I describe this, it works pretty well in that example, but in many examples, it's too subtle to try to figure out what numbers you want to put in the profit matrix. So I actually prefer using that add-in and just seeing how the errors vary as you change the cutoff probability. But if you do it this way, it will actually build into your model Let me click this save to a column as a column property. Let's click OK. And what it does is it now adds in see if it did. Oh, it saves a column property. What I think you have to do is actually rerun this. Oh, hold on a second. Oh, it's here in the decision matrix. Excuse me. So with that profit matrix, which I did not reason out real carefully exactly what to put in it, you can see what the profit matrix is that I entered here. And what it's actually done is it has actually changed its predictions. And you can notice that it has actually made a lot more errors of this type than of this type. So it's doesn't want to predict that we will retain customers that are not retained. It's willing to make lots of mistakes. Almost half of the people it's predicting will be retained. Almost half the people that are actually retained, it predicted would not be retained. We sent out a lot of free offers to people that was not necessary, but that's because I made these errors so asymmetric. I thought this is automatically saved. Make sure that I didn't have to check something here. Let's just do save prediction formula again. Let me see if I needed to do that to get it. Yeah, okay, so actually I don't know if I needed to do that or I just didn't scroll over far enough, but these are the columns that get added when you have a profit matrix. It gives you how much profit you would make on each person if they were not retained, or if they're predicted to not be retained, or if they're predicted to be retained using that profit matrix. It says what is the most profitable prediction for each person, what is the expected profit we'll get, and it shows the actual profit that we get, which would be negative for all the errors and positive for all the non-errors here. So it attaches all these columns that are adjusted to that profit matrix. I don't use the profit matrix. It's a neat tool, but you'll see in the document that I'll put up, it's rather subtle to figure out what to put in it, so I tend not to use it. When you do attach it as a column property, though, you will go to the retain column here. Column properties, profit matrix, that's where that information is put in. You could have put this in at the beginning of this before building the model and attached the profit matrix as a property to the column, and then anytime you do an analysis and make a prediction, it will use that profit matrix in making its prediction. So it's automatically adjusting the cutoff, recognizing the asymmetry of the errors in your model. So it's nice because it's automatic and you don't have to look at each of the cutoff probabilities, but I think you're far less likely to make mistakes if you just take the time to put that add-in in and just look at different cutoff probabilities and say, what am I most comfortable living with here? How many errors of one type, false negatives, in exchange for false positives, or vice versa, and thinking about the implications of that for your particular problem. And I think you're far more likely to make the right decision, the best decision you can, and understand why you made that decision. Sweeping it into the profit matrix is like sweeping it under the rug. And it's nice that it does all this automatically, but you better be pretty sure that when you put in this numbers in this, that you got the right numbers in there. And it's not that easy to tell, I think, in most applications. I found it difficult to figure out what numbers I wanted to put in there. So that's the basic decision tree. The downside of the decision tree for classification is that, like I said, errors will propagate through the tree. It can't pick up interactions, so it's not a very robust technique. And there are two techniques that basically overcome, to a great extent, those limitations, and that will be in the next video.